But just how accurately was the Tanakh copied? Because of the antiquity of the originals and the perishable materials they were written on, we can't get nearly as close to the autographs as we can with the New Testament. But we do know that the Jews were extremely careful when copying the scriptures. A group of men called the Talmudists took on the responsibility of copying the Tanakh in Hebrew in the years following AD 70. The Talmudists developed a very strict set of rules for making copies. Each page of the codex must have the same number of text columns. The columns had to be at between 48 and 60 lines long. Each line had to be 30 letters long. The spacing between letters, lines, sections, and books had to follow very specific rules as well. The Torah had to end exactly at the end of a line, and nothing, not even part of a letter, could be written from memory. The ink had to be black and had to be made in a very specific way. The name of God could not be the first thing written after dipping the pen in ink. And the copyists had to wear specific clothes and follow certain rules about bathing. Contrary to how we think, the Jews preferred the newest copies, not the oldest. Thus, if a Tanakh was found to be in error, damaged, or blemished in any way, the copy was burned, buried, or given to schools for lessons. From AD 500 to 900, the task of preserving and transmitting the Tanakh was assumed by the Masoretes. By this time there was a concern that the proper pronunciation of the Hebrew would be lost. The problem was that the Hebrew alphabet did not contain any vowels. To ensure the accurate passing down of oral tradition, the Masoretes developed a system of markings that surrounded the consonants and acted as vowels. Like the Talmudists, the Masoretes also had rules for ensuring the accuracy of their copies. They would count the number of words and letters in each book, and also count the middle word and middle letter. They even knew the number of times each letter of the alphabet appeared in each book. If a copy did not agree exactly with the original, it was destroyed. Because of the great pains that were taken by the scribes to ensure exact copies, it was long assumed that the text was very accurate, but there was no way to know for sure. That is, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before 1947, there were about 700 known Hebrew manuscripts, none of them earlier than the Middle Ages. This changed dramatically with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls because the writings were stored in vessels that were kept in dry and arid climates that kept them from rotting. There are a number of versions of the story of how the scrolls were discovered. Although we'll probably never know exactly how it happened with certainty, the basic story goes like this. In 1947, 7 ancient manuscripts were offered for sale by a Bethlehem antiquities dealer. He had bought them from a Bedouin shepherd who had found them in a cave near Qumran on the Dead Sea. The shepherd had been looking for a lost goat. Rather than crawl into every cave in the area, he decided to throw rocks into the cave and hopefully scare the goat out. But in one cave he heard the breaking of a clay jar. He let himself into the cave and found a large number of clay jars that contained ancient manuscripts written on parchment. The shepherd's first thought was that the old parchment could be used for sandal straps. So the scrolls were taken back to his tent and hung there for a time before being sold in Jerusalem. The scrolls were then resold, with some eventually finding their way to the international market. The price of $250,000 for several of the scrolls in 1954 ignited a gold rush of sorts among the Bedouin, as well as a number of archaeological expeditions. About 270 caves in the area were explored. 10 of them contained more manuscripts. In all, over 40,000 fragments were discovered from 500 different books and writings. Of these books, every single book of the Old Testament except Esther was found. Most importantly, the writings dated from the 3rd century BC, a portion of Samuel, to the 1st century AD, far older than the oldest previously known manuscripts. Probably the biggest find was one of the first scrolls discovered in Cave 1, a copy of Isaiah from about 150 to 100 BC. This discovery provided the opportunity to see just how accurately the Hebrew scriptures had been transmitted. Comparison with a second, though incomplete copy of Isaiah, also found at Qumran, showed more than a 95% agreement in the texts. The 5% of disagreement had to do with misspellings and copying errors. More importantly, the Masoretic text, copied 1,000 years later, also agrees with the Isaiah scroll more than 95% of the time. For example, in Isaiah 53, the difference between the two is just 17 letters, 10 of which are spelling variances and 4 are stylistic changes. The 3 letters of real variance don't change the text in any substantial way. So we see that the gap between the end of the writing and the oldest copies was cut by over 1,000 years by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. After the completion of the translation of the Tanakh into Greek, other writings containing the history of the Jews from the time of Malachi, around 450 BC, to the birth of Jesus were translated as well. Although these books were held to be very important by the Jews, they were not considered scriptural. Their content not only contained some historical and factual errors, but also taught things that did not agree with Scripture. They were, however, added to many versions of the Septuagint, creating what is sometimes referred to as the Septuagint Plus. When Jerome translated the Old Testament into Latin in the 4th century, he included these books, designating them as apocryphal. Like the Jews, he considered them as having some value, but that they were not fit for the formulation of doctrine. With the caveat of their non-canonical status, the books continued to be included into the Bible until shortly after the Reformation. The apocryphal books were largely dropped from inclusion in the Bible, except in versions authorized by the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. If the Old Testament does contain actual and accurate history, then we can expect archaeology to corroborate it. And this is just what we find. Some of the more important discoveries include the following. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. In 1846, a 6.5-foot tall pillar of black limestone was found in the biblical city of Calah. This 4-sided monument commemorated, among other things, the receiving of a tribute by Assyrian king Shalmaneser III from Jehu, son of Omri, in 841 BC. It contains the oldest known picture of an ancient Israelite. The obelisk can be seen in the British Museum. The Cyrus Cylinder. In the 19th century, a 6th century BC clay cylinder was found bearing an inscription concerning Cyrus the Persian. After taking control of Babylon in 539 BC, he issued a decree allowing Babylonian captives to return to their homes. This decree corresponds to an account of Cyrus in Ezra 1:1-3, and 6, verse 3. It resides in the British Museum. The Taylor Prism. Sennacherib's library in Nineveh, dating from the 8th century BC, housed up to 100,000 texts, including the Taylor Prism. This prism is a 6-sided clay cylinder with an inscription detailing Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. It also mentions Hezekiah as being like a caged bird within his royal capital. 2 Kings 18 and 19, 2 Chronicles 32, and Isaiah 36 and 37 are all corroborated by the Taylor Prism. The Taylor Prism is currently housed in the British Museum. The Gilgamesh Epic. Also found in the library at Nineveh was a set of 12 tablets containing an epic poem about a king named Gilgamesh. Tablet 11 was the first find that contained a non-biblical account of the Genesis flood. Gilgamesh is noted as the 5th king after the Great Flood. Though the stories don't totally agree, there are many similarities. This is also in the British Museum. The Moabite Stone. In 1868, a stone was discovered in Palestine that contained an inscription in ancient Moabite. Not only does the inscription mention Mesha, the Moabite king who rebelled against Israelite rule in 2 Kings 3, but it also mentions the name Yahweh. The Moabite stone is housed in the Louvre. The Tel Dan Stele. In 1993 and 1994, the Tel Dan Stele was found in Israel. This is an Aramaic inscription apparently commissioned by Hazael to commemorate his victory at Ramoth Gilead in 2 Kings 8:28-29. It's noteworthy for referring to the king of Judah as the House of David. This is the first extra-biblical evidence for the fact that the dynasty of David ruled in Jerusalem. In conclusion, we see that although the Old Testament was written as long as 3,400 years ago, Its content has been extremely well preserved, and that we have good reason to treat it as trustworthy.